Welcome to the second episode of Five to Survive. In this series, we're asking experts about chapters in my upcoming book, Survival of the Fit. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to Professor at Plymouth State University, Dr. Rebecca Noel. Dr. Noel is an expert in 19th century physical education, which we discuss in my book as we try to follow the path from compulsory education and the start of physical education to where we are now in the 21st century. Dr. Noel is the author of the upcoming book, Save Our Scholars, The Quest for Health in American Schools. So Becky, I can't thank you enough for being here and giving us this historian's perspective on physical education and some of the topics in the book. But just to start, paint us a picture. What did physical education look like back in the day when school was becoming compulsory?
Right, so that's a great question because it has a few questions inside it. Because school became compulsory at really different times in different states. So it covers a lot of outside history as well, once you start looking at that range of dates. So in Massachusetts, which is the first state to make schooling compulsory, that happened in 1852, before the Civil War. In other states, it was way up 1900 and of course beyond in places that weren't states yet. So what that means is that schooling's going to look really different in 1852 versus 1900. But if you're thinking about a physical education class in the places that launched physical education classes, that's going to be New England before the Civil War, and especially Massachusetts. And that's not going to be a physical education class at all in any way we could recognize. So here were a few options. One was what they called manual labor. This was mostly boys, and that is farming, gardening, carpentry, sometimes tinsmithing. Educators recognized that somebody like a blacksmith was just beautifully bulky in their physique on top, and they were like, we don't look like blacksmiths. Maybe we should get some of the benefits of physical labor that craftspeople undertake. So manual labor was one big sort of fad that would come and go every so often. Another was what was called, for boys, gymnastics. And that came out of Germany, originally ancient Greece, but was revived in Germany, and particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, which kind of had this military nationalistic piece behind it. And that was brought over to the US starting in the 1820s for boys. If you call it gymnastics, girls are not going to do it. Gymnastics was very masculine. So in the 1820s, a couple of educators invented the term calisthenics, which is Greek for, beauty and strength. Okay, now girls can do it. And calisthenics looked a little different from gymnastics even then. Girls' calisthenics were very actually close to dance, would sometimes have overhead equipment like a triangle that was hanging from the ceiling that you could do some sort of hanging exercises with, or a wand that you would raise or lower, do various wand exercises that were pretty low level. And one feature, speaking not as a kinesiologist, but as a historian, it looks to me as though it was a very common pattern was that those exercises done for girls did not involve crossing space. They were very upper body and very low key. In Boston in the 1830s, they started to interrupt school for 5 minutes, maybe a couple times a day. And you could even buy school desks where the chairs flipped up so that people could stand right in front of their chairs and do calisthenics where they were, because schools weren't going to necessarily dedicate a whole room to it. That's all before the Civil War. When we're talking about a physical education class after the Civil War, it's going to start to look a little bit more like what we've seen in our day, but still be a lot of emphasis on calisthenics for girls and young women, even in colleges.
So I think you answered my second question also. In my book, Survival of the Fit, I talk about this concept of physical identity and how children are born with this desire to explore the outdoors, to run around, to be children, basically. But it's essentially beaten out of them over time in school, and now with computers and all these other options, kids lose their physical identity. But clearly, that was not the concept back then, or what do you think was the concept? Were they really trying to make these kids fit, or were these kids doing plenty of stuff after school to stay fit?
Oh yeah, that's such a great question. Well, there were a couple things going on. One was after Rousseau, right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book Émile is talking about children, sort of the natural child. So the idea that you see in Émile of the natural child gets really taken up kind of apart from a lot of the other things going on in that book. And people are always comparing children to baby animals. They're like little lambs. They're like little birds. They're like little kittens. And this is a really interesting move, right? Because it's like saying, we don't need to train them. We just need to set them free. But the motivations for school exercise were also different. Now we're really concerned about child obesity. We're really concerned about just the sedentary nature of modern life. They were concerned about the sedentary nature of their lives too in the period before the Civil War, but they weren't concerned about obesity. They were worried kids were too thin. Because if they're too thin, then they look like someone who has consumption, which we would call tuberculosis, which was a deadly killer, but a very slow one. So they were very worried about consumption. Starting around 1820 in New England, there was a spike in the consumption death rate. And it had a very high incidence and visibility.
I know your time period is more 19th century.
Yeah.
Where do we see the change? Well, for sure, it seemed like it happened in the early 1900s. But where do we see the change from what you're talking about, that fitness and hygiene and this sort of emphasis on physical education, and when it turns into sports? And in competitive sports.
So it starts off as maybe student-run clubs. I've read diaries of boys in this period, and they'll say, "Yeah, it's April. We're all playing hockey," which they mean sort of field hockey. Now it's May. We're all playing football. There's kind of a seasonality to it, but it's not very organized, other than by season. It starts to get more organized in the late 19th century when K-12 schools in general expand their mandate to include more extracurriculars. So it comes in around the same time as like debate clubs and theater activities run by the adults in the high school. That's when you start getting more organization of interscholastic sports, and they're picking it up from what was maybe a couple decades ahead in colleges. There's also a lot of community club sports, as you probably know, like the early baseball teams were clubs. That's also sometimes located in at work sites. You know, like a factory would have a baseball team or whatever. So schools are not the pioneers in that. They're sort of absorbing it from these other locations.
So let me put you on the spot then, as a parent and as a historian in the 21st century. What would you do to maybe adjust physical education over the century and a half or whatever that we're talking about, where you saw it kind of maybe break bad, or where it could have gone to a better direction?
What I really think we need more of is just integration of movement throughout the day and throughout the curriculum. I think more of that's been happening at elementary schools in a really helpful way, and never completely went away in elementary schools, but just more movement. We just like, let's all get up and, I don't know, do 5 minutes of yoga, or 5 minutes of jumping jacks, or something just simple and small, but much more frequent, much more kind of organic to what else is going on, which in a way gets you right back to what educators were doing in the 1830s, right? We're going to take a walk, and it's going to be a walk, and we're going to look at flowers and how they grow. But I saw my daughter, even in high school, in these incredibly aggressive volleyball gym classes where she was getting her glasses smashed into her face, and she was like, why do I have to do this? She hated it. She only had to do it a couple semesters. It was like once or twice a week. And I kept saying to her, I'm writing a book about how you should be doing more PE.
Yeah,
And she's like, yeah, thanks a lot, Mom.
exactly. And I would
But
call
not
that,
like that.
right, I would call that a physical identity killer. When the kids have an experience like that, and then the difference is in 2020 is that they can go into a video game and dominate the video
Yeah.
game and not get their glasses knocked off in the process. Yeah, which
Right.
is terrible. So last question, and again, with a historic perspective, what can we do to raise all boats? And when we talk about the fields of Eton, obviously we're talking about princes and the real top society. But what do you think we can do to get every kid involved, and even that kid in the inner city and that kid in the poor rural areas that we have even in our state here?
I guess I think, first of all, integrating movement the way I suggested is pretty cheap and doesn't require a whole lot of facilities. I wish that there was some more way to equalize or make less disparity between the sports facilities at the most wealthy schools and the least wealthy schools, and just de-emphasize organized sports as the form of movement. But that's hard, right? Because parents get excited, towns get excited. It's a way to kind of coalesce support for schools, but it just soaks up so much resources. And even then, you have to look at some other factors. Like, I know this from serving on the athletic council at PSU. A football team roster has like 80 people on it. In order to stay in compliance with Title IX, it doesn't have to be exactly one-to-one, person-to-person, or dollar for dollar. Several different ways to be in compliance with Title IX. But we have several varsity sports for women that we don't have for men, because we're trying to stay within that range. Doesn't have to be 50-50, but we're trying to stay within the compliance range, because football puts a brick on the scale for men and takes up so much money and huge facilities. And I'm not saying there should never be football. It's a beautiful game, but oh my goodness, I wish we could rethink some of the balance of what we pay for.
Well, I might have to bring you back for another 5 questions because there's all kinds of things today. But I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your schedule, and we look forward to reading your book and also maybe talking again. So thanks
Yeah,
so
thanks
much.
so much, Dan. Thanks a lot.